This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
This is The World Today, 15 minutes of the latest goings on from around the world. I am Peninah Karibe in Nairobi. The top stories. At least 7 people are killed after a car carrying migrants crashes in Hungary. The U.S. Secretary of State says Washington would look to expand its military and economic relationships in the Indo-Pacific. And the World Health Organization Africa office speaks on Omicron status on the continent as Nigeria now considers diplomacy over flight bans. At least 7 people have been killed and 4 injured in Hungary as a car carrying migrants crashed into a house. Police say the driver refused to stop for a police check at Murahalum near the border with Serbia. The car was carrying a Serbian license plate. The driver has been detained and faces charges of trafficking and causing a fatal mass accident. The U.S. Secretary of State says he is seeking a free and open Indo-Pacific. Antony Blinken said Washington would look to expand its military and economic relationships to counter China's growing influence in the region. He also said he would work to put pressure on Myanmar's military junta, but he stressed the U.S. was not trying to force countries to choose between the United States and China, nor was it seeking conflict with China. He is visiting Indonesia as part of a 3-nation tour of Southeast Asia that will also take him to Malaysia and Thailand. The Chinese Foreign Ministry says the United States stance will only stir up confrontation and pose threats to Asia's stability. Spokesman Wang Wenbin says the U.S. are exaggerating the Chinese threat while also insisting they do not seek conflict with China. Wang said these actions are inconsistent with the dialogue expressed between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping recently. He said the U.S. should promote cooperation in the region instead of drawing ideological lines. A number of high-ranking U.S. officials have visited Southeast Asian nations in recent months. Wang Haiyang has more.
4 years after the Trump administration's America First agenda, the U.S. is trying to build a more united front. And that includes a growing diplomatic engagement in Southeast Asia. A series of visits by senior officials began with Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman in late May and June, signaling a comeback. She urged Cambodia to adopt a balanced policy. In Indonesia, she touted shared values and called for cooperation in Thailand. In July, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin visited Singapore, Vietnam, and the Philippines. He stressed that deterrence remained the cornerstone of the U.S. security umbrella in the region. He said that the U.S. will not flinch when its interests are threatened, but said the U.S. is committed to a constructive role with China. In Singapore, Vice President Kamala Harris declared that the partnerships in Singapore, in Southeast Asia, and throughout the Indo-Pacific are a top priority. She sought to reassure Southeast Asian governments that the U.S. would not force countries to choose between it and China. But she called on Vietnam to join the U.S. in challenging China is what she called coercion. Southeast Asian nations have avoided taking sides, adopting a hedging strategy. Wang Haiyang, CGTN.
Nigeria has now resolved to diplomacy after 4 countries placed it on their COVID-19 red list. The move comes a day after Nigeria's aviation minister Hadi Sirika had recommended that flights from Argentina, Britain, Canada and Saudi Arabia be banned in retaliation. The 4 nations have banned arrivals from Nigeria over the detection of the Omicron coronavirus variant last month. The United Kingdom, one of the countries to place Nigeria on the COVID-19 red list, has said it will not reverse its travel ban over the threat of reciprocity. The Pentagon says no U.S. troops or officials will face punishment for a drone strike on Kabul in August. The strike killed 10 Afghans, including 7 children. The U.S. Defense Department has admitted to the strike, launched in the final days of its withdrawal from Afghanistan. It says it was a tragic mistake that killed civilians. Pentagon officials earlier had defended the strike as necessary to stop a possible Islamic State attack on U.S. forces evacuating people at Kabul's airport. Russian President Vladimir Putin has spoken with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson over tensions with Ukraine. He says he wants immediate talks with the West to curb any potential NATO expansion to the east. Moscow denies the U.S. intelligence assessment that Russia may be planning a multi-front attack on Ukraine as early as next year. Johnson has expressed concern over Russia's alleged large-scale movement of troops along its border with Ukraine. He says any destabilizing action will lead to serious consequences and has stressed the importance of de-escalating tensions through diplomacy. The Chinese mainland has reported another imported Omicron case, this time in the southern city of Guangzhou. The infected person is a 67-year-old man who entered China from overseas late November. The man was placed under quarantine and is currently undergoing treatment. This comes after the northern city of Tianjin reported China's first case of Omicron on Monday. That person was an asymptomatic carrier who had also arrived from abroad. The Chinese mainland has reported 51 new local cases in all. 44 have been detected in Zhejiang province. The others are scattered in Inner Mongolia, Heilongjiang and Shanxi. The UK has reported the first Omicron death. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has introduced a Plan B against the variant and people are encouraged to work from home. Omicron is responsible for a third of London's current infections. All adults in the UK are now able to go for their booster dose. Guy Henderson reports.
With the Omicron variant spreading rapidly across the UK, the British government's message now is go out and get your booster jab. That is now available to all UK adults. The target is to roll out 1 million jabs a day between now and the end of the year. The Prime Minister was asked earlier on Monday whether he would rule out the possibility of more stringent measures before Christmas, as he was forced to do in the build-up to the previous festive season at the end of 2020. He could not rule it out.
I think the idea that this is somehow a milder version of the virus, I think that's something we need to set on one side and just recognise the sheer pace at which it accelerates through the population. So the best thing we can all do is get our boosters.
Because the fact is, nobody knows the exact nature of the threat posed by the Omicron variant. It is now apparent that the transmissibility is higher than that of Delta. What is not yet clear, of course, is to what extent hospitalisations and deaths will begin to increase in the days, weeks, months ahead. One death related to Omicron has now been confirmed in the UK. Sadly, it is inevitable that more are to come. Guy Henderson, CGTN, London.
The United States has recorded more than 50 million cases of COVID-19. The Delta variant is still dominant, accounting for 99% of cases. But the Omicron variant has reportedly spread across the country. California will reinstitute a statewide mask mandate in all indoor public spaces. AD's Tian San reports from Los Angeles.
This is a grim milestone for the United States and its battle against COVID-19. I remember not long ago reporting on the first 100,000 deaths, and that was a big shock for the nation and hard to grasp at the time. Now multiply that by 8. It's been a bigger toll on the elderly. Nearly 75% of the people, about 600,000 of the 800,000 who have died of the virus in the US, have been 65 or older. Some 61% of Americans have been fully vaccinated, but many have yet to even get one dose. The coronavirus pandemic is approaching the end of its second year, and despite a steady decline earlier this fall, we are once again seeing a surge in the number of infections and hospitalizations, especially in the Midwest, Southwest, and New England. Experts are worried the holiday period with increased travel and winter weather with more indoor gatherings could make matters worse. As of Monday, New York State began requiring people to wear masks at all indoor public spaces that do not require proof of full vaccination against the coronavirus. And New York's earlier mandate requiring healthcare workers be vaccinated against the coronavirus, even with religious objections, is still in effect after the Supreme Court refused to block it on Monday. Here in Los Angeles, coronavirus case rates have risen by more than 33% in the last 2.5 weeks. As of Wednesday, the state is reinstating the mask mandate for indoor public settings, applicable to everyone regardless of their vaccination status. But several other states have either stayed away from implementing any kind of mask or vaccine mandates or have faced legal challenges. This comes at a time when the worrisome Omicron variant spreads across communities, raising yet more questions than answers. It is Tianshan, CGTN, Los Angeles.
United Nations Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez has warned against criminal exploitation of COVID-19 recovery resources. In a video message to the 9th session of the Conference of the State Parties to the UN Convention Against Corruption in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, the top UN official warned that countries investing in COVID-19 recovery must guard against the diversion of vital resources by criminal opportunists. The week-long summit kicked off on Monday and ends on Friday, the 17th. It is attended by representatives from 152 countries, including members of the civil society, academia, government and the private sector. The UN Convention Against Corruption is so far the only legally binding instrument against the vice and was established in 2005. The convention requires member states to criminalize corruption and to promote international cooperation in recovery of stolen state assets. And that's it for this edition of The World Today. I'll be back shortly with more news from the continent in Africa Live. Thanks for watching.
This is it. I'm just about to be shot.
The little tents here, bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
Who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
gas, so it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
is the front line now after 9 days of fighting.
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from
Within
the front
clear
line.
view of this front line position.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Ghana's main airport to effect hefty fines against airlines bringing in unvaccinated travelers. Tunisian president promises to hold referendum and elections next year, but will this end the nation's political crisis? And UN chief warns against criminal exploitation of COVID-19 recovery resources as anti-corruption conference begins in Egypt. This is Africa Live. Hello and thank you for joining us. I am Peninah Karibe. Also coming up, in business, Egypt targets $10 billion in exports to African markets. And in sports, the Africa Handball Championship set for Morocco postponed. A $3,500 fine will be slapped on any passenger who flies into Ghana without being vaccinated. The rule also applies to those who test positive for coronavirus upon arrival. The measures have been imposed at Kotoka International Airport in the capital, Accra. Authorities say that in the last 2 weeks, 60% of all cases in Ghana have been recorded at the airport. Officials in the country launched a major vaccination drive this month to be enforced in January. The vaccine mandate is targeting government employees, health workers and students. Ghana's tightening of COVID measures comes as the European Investment Bank announced an $85 million investment loan to support its pandemic response. Governments in Africa are now taking steps to ensure COVID-19 vaccinations are compulsory. Here are some of the countries that have imposed vaccine mandates. In West Africa, Mauritania and Nigeria have made vaccination compulsory for state employees. Ghana will follow suit, targeting all public sector and health workers from January. In North Africa, Egypt mandated government employees to be vaccinated before mid-November. University students in public institutions were also advised to take the jab in order to access campuses. Meanwhile, Morocco and Tunisia introduced vaccine passes in October. They will be used to gain entry in public and private administrations, as well as public spaces such as restaurants and transport systems. Over in East Africa, Djibouti issued a presidential decree in June, making the jab compulsory for all those over 25 years of age. This includes foreigners residing in the country. In Kenya, residents must show proof of immunization by December 21st in order to access public services. Finally, in Southern Africa, Zimbabwe ordered all state workers to get vaccinated in July or risk getting barred from their workplaces. Private companies have imitated the move. The South African government says it is still holding consultations on vaccine mandates. However, various organizations have already imposed vaccination as a requirement for access. Tunisian President Kais Saied has said a constitutional referendum will be held next July, with parliamentary elections to follow at the end of 2022. The president laid out the timeline for his proposed political changes in a televised speech. He says the referendum would take place following an online public consultation that will start in January. The referendum date is Tunisia's Republic Day and the anniversary of his sudden intervention. This announcement of a roadmap out of the crisis has been awaited since President Saied suspended parliament, dismissed the Prime Minister and assumed executive authority. To discuss this further, we have Dr. Norhan El-Sheikh live in Cairo. She is a professor of political science at Cairo University. Thank you very much, Dr. El-Sheikh, for joining us from Cairo. So, will this constitutional referendum resolve the standoff between the president's side and those who have been protesting the suspension of parliament and demanding elections?
I think what President Saied declared, which we considered as a roadmap, that may calm the pressures, Western pressures and Western demands. Last G7 demanded clearly to clarify what would be next in Tunisia. So it may calm that pressures from outside. It may also help to calm some pressures from inside, particularly those supported Qais Said, but want to know also what would be next. So it was very important, that roadmap, but it will not calm all demands or all pressures, because one of the main element of that demonstrations, etc., is brotherhood leading pressures. So those leaded or Muslim brotherhood behind wouldn't be came to an end, because the ideological factors will still continue. But I think it's a step forward and help to more stability for Tunisia inside, and also more acceptable or acceptance to what Qais Said is introduced in the international and regional arena.
The president's actions in July were prompted by the people's violent protests over the economy and the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. But there are also constitutional reform issues. What do we expect to see in the referendum discussions?
The most important issue that may attract the attention and debate along Tunisia is how much freedom would be guaranteed to individuals, to associations, to NGOs, because in Tunisia, NGOs enjoyed usually a space, a very important space and freedom in movement, in activities, in also getting donations from outside. So I think one of the most important issue which would be raised and want to be granted is the freedom for association, NGOs, individuals, press, etc. And I think if President Qais Said guaranteed that in the new constitution, that would attract more support to him. And he is really wanted to do that, because other fractions in Tunisia, rather than brotherhood, the most important issue for them is to enjoy democracy, is to enjoy freedom of speech and freedom of NGOs in general, and civil society to have its own freedoms and activities. So I think that would attract much more discussion, and if it would be granted, that would help a lot in stability in Tunis.
Dr. Noran El-Sheikh, thank you very much for speaking to us. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez has warned against criminal exploitation of COVID-19 recovery resources. In a video message to the 9th session of the Conference of the States Parties to the UN Convention Against Corruption in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, the top UN official warned that countries investing in COVID-19 recovery must guard against the diversion of vital resources by criminal opportunists. The week-long summit kicked off on Monday and ends on Friday, the 17th. It is attended by representatives from 152 countries, including members of the civil society, academia, government and the private sector. The UN Convention Against Corruption is so far the only legally binding instrument against the vice and was established in 2005. The convention requires member states to criminalize corruption and to promote international cooperation in recovery of stolen state assets.
Corruption spreads through societies and erodes people's trust in leaders and institutions. It deepens inequalities, feeds cynicism and alienation, and reinforces the obstacles facing women and girls. Greed over need harms us all. As countries invest in recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, we must guard against the diversion of vital resources by criminal opportunists. Tackling corruption is essential to protect human rights and promote democratic accountability. It is an important step towards inclusive, sustainable development.
We are very much aware that combating corruption is not the sole responsibility of governments, but people have a key role to play in that. This is why we made the effort in the past years to promote inclusion and empower women and youth, since we believe that empowering women contributes to strengthening government's efforts.
25 minutes into the hour, this is Africa Live. Let's take a quick break. Coming up. The DRC says the presence of Ugandan troops fighting ADF rebels will only be for a limited period. And fears of humanitarian crisis in Somalia as people escaping drought and famine rush to main cities.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
In the Democratic Republic of Congo, President Felix Tshisekedi says the presence of Ugandan troops in the country will only be for a limited period. Uganda and Congo launched a joint operation this month to fight the Allied Democratic Forces, an armed group collaborating with Islamic State. However, not much information has been disclosed about the scope of the operation and its expected duration. So far, at least 1,700 Ugandan soldiers have crossed into eastern Congo. Uganda's defense ministry says its troops will stay as long as needed to fight off and defeat the ADF.
Our two countries recently agreed to join forces in order to operate together against this common enemy. Our parliament, fully informed, will ensure that the presence of Ugandan troops in our soil is limited to the time strictly necessary for this operation.
Between an influx of displaced people and poor harvests, hunger threatens northern Burkina Faso. And as CGTN's Wanja Mungai reports, conflict in the country is worsening the situation.
1 in 4 children under the age of 5, like 9-month-old Sakinatu Amadou, suffered from stunted growth. This is due to malnutrition, among other things.
Her mother died. I took the child to the medical center. After the consultation, the child was found to be ill.
Burkina Faso derives 80% of its resources from agriculture, but since 2015, the country has been caught up in a spiral of violence. The unrest has been attributed to armed jihadist groups affiliated to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State organization. The attacks are increasingly frequent and mostly concentrated in the north and east of the country, like in Dori in Seno province.
Now nobody wants to come to Dori. Nobody. Once in Ouagadougou, I spoke to a young man who told me, even if you pay me $1,800, I won't come to Dori.
Attacks have left around 2,000 people dead and 1.4 million displaced.
This year, we have received 144 displaced pupils from areas with a very high security risk. When they came here, they were traumatized children. Parents, when they come to us with their children, you can see an indescribable sadness. Once we welcome the children and they see that at lunchtime they have a meal that they share with other pupils, it facilitates integration.
United Nations agencies are now warning that the number of food insecure people in West and Central Africa has risen to a record high of 28 million people. And if nothing is done to bring these numbers down, the trend will continue to go up. Wanja Mungai, CGTN.
The number of people displaced by ongoing drought and famine in Somalia is increasing every day, with new arrivals in the main cities seeking humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian agencies say the situation could escalate if expected seasonal rains do not begin in the next few weeks. Mohamed Kahie has the details from an internally displaced people's camp outside the capital, Mogadishu.
This is an internally displaced camp outskirts of Somalia's capital, Mogadishu. It's home to hundreds of people affected by the ongoing drought in the country. They were farmers and livestock keepers who lost their livelihoods. Halima Hassan, a single mother of 6 children, just arrived in the camp a week ago from the agricultural town of Toro in Lower Shabelle region. She lost her cattle to the drought and could not farm due to the delayed rainy season.
I lost my livestock. Also, no farming, no water, and conflict, nowhere to run to. That is why I came here. I've been here with this family for the past 5 days.
The Somali government and humanitarian agencies are scaling up their efforts to reach out to displaced families like Halima, but that is not enough. There is still a scarcity of food and water for the new arrivals.
As we are speaking now, I don't have anything. No shelter, farm or livestock, food or water. I'm a burden to this family. I eat the little they have.
The Somali government declared a state of humanitarian emergency late last month as drought ravaged 80% of the country. Since then, local initiatives have been mobilized to reach out to hard-hit areas as aid agencies appeal for more funding. Mohamed Kahie, CGTN, Mogadishu, Somalia.
Coming up in business news, Egypt targets $10 billion in exports to African markets. And developers are concerned about Uganda's rising population in urban areas.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Tunis, Cairo,
Juba,
Johannesburg, Ethiopia, Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines.
You've got to get out, go there, and you'll find them. In the bazaars of Casablanca, among the crowds in Cairo,
who come to visit Cairo, the ancient capital of Egypt.
Along the waters of the Nile, along the sands of the Sahara. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. No one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Egypt has announced a plan to double exports to African countries to $10 billion by 2025. Authorities say the first phase will see the North African state raise its exports to $7 billion by the end of next year, up from the current $5 billion. From Cairo, here's Yasser Hakim with the details.
Egyptian exports to its African neighbors is meager for the continent's second largest economy. Out of the total $5 billion exported by the country, only $605 million came from non-Arab African nations.
I don't want to repeat the obvious. Intra-African trade is very weak and there is potential to raise it 2- and 3-fold. This is what we are working on. Having 7 bureaus that give us reach to about 30 African nations reflects our interest in African markets, not just for exports but imports too, and also increased trade exchange, not just in raw materials but manufactured products as well.
The government's plans to double exports to $10 billion by 2025 will take 3 stages. The first phase will concentrate on 10 countries, including Kenya and Nigeria. Exports will range from agricultural products to fertilizers, chemicals, medical equipment, and electric appliances. But there are challenges that Egyptian companies will have to navigate to conquer the African markets.
We need to encourage the banks, the Egyptian banks, to open channels in Africa to be able to support the exporters. We need to get the shipping lines into different parts of Africa. That's the first thing. And the other thing is the financial support to the exporters and opening channels to be able to export and get paid for what you export.
The government has intervened to support exporters and help them become competitive.
Knowing the recent issues with shipping and its complications, we have decided to cover 50% of shipping costs for any exporters to African countries. We launched a new initiative to provide financing to 1,600 companies as part of the Export Subsidy Fund. We also give exporters special discounts on their expenses like tariffs, taxes, electricity and gas bills. Saving money on these items will help exporters spend more on production, expansion and exports.
The North African country will benefit from the African Free Trade Area and the COMESA presidency to implement this strategy. It's also building transport infrastructure, roads, seaports, railway and air routes to guarantee a free flow of goods with its neighbors in the continent. Yasser Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
All right, some news just in. The World Health Organization says that Africa is now officially in the 4th wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, partly due to the Omicron variant. The director of the WHO Africa Regional Office, Dr. Mashidiso Moeti, who is currently addressing the press, has said that there has been an 83% surge in new cases in Africa this week compared to last week. However, there are fewer deaths in the early stages of this current wave. We will bring you more in our later bulletins. Now, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development has suspended South Sudan from the regional bloc due to failure to pay annual fees owed to the regional body. South Sudan's government, however, says it's making preparations to pay the dues to the Trading and Security Regional Body. CGTN's Patrick Oyet has the details.
The suspension is because South Sudan has not paid its membership fees amounting to $9 million. The residents of South Sudan's capital, Juba, are reacting to the suspension.
We also, as South Sudan, have a lot of things in common with these neighboring countries. We do trade together with them. Look at the security of South Sudan and the security in the region. We need to work together with them so that all these are in place. But then if we are out of this will really affect us badly.
Suspending South Sudan now will affect the ongoing peace implementation because peace cannot go on when no pressure comes from the regional bloc like IGAD. But I think the government of South Sudan should think of resolving the issue by paying the money that the regional bloc needs.
IGAD, an East African trading and security bloc of 8 nations, was founded in 1986. The 8 IGAD member states are Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Kenya, Somalia, Sudan, Uganda, and South Sudan. South Sudan is oil dependent and it is struggling to revive its economy battered by years of conflict since December 2013.
It was decided that the Minister of Foreign Affairs discuss all this with the new Minister of Finance so that they can chart out the way forward in order to pay all the outstanding arrears.
In July last year, the East African Community EAC threatened to suspend South Sudan over failure to pay annual contributions to the body. IGAD mediated a South Sudan's peace process which ended a 6-year civil war in the country. It is also monitoring the implementation of that peace deal signed in 2018. Patrick Koyet, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
In Uganda, the rising population growth in urban areas is worrying developers, with urban planners warning that more employment structures are urgently needed. Uganda's urban population is estimated to increase by 5% every year. Isabel Nakiria reports.
Peter Sally runs a chapati stall in Kampala. His family in rural Uganda was unable to support him. He came to Uganda in 2018 to find work after dropping out of school because he was unable to pay the fees. But life in Kampala has been a roller coaster ride for Sally.
A friend of mine brought me to Kampala, but I had no qualifications that could earn me a job. So I learned how to make chapati, and that's how I survive.
Sally earns $1.4 a day, hardly enough to keep him going. His stall is also situated on a road, and he risks being kicked out by city officials, the Kampala Capital City Authority.
The COVID-19 situation just worsened things. Sometimes we don't even work. KCCA sometimes confiscates our equipment, but we persist.
Thousands of young people like Sally trek to the city every year with the hope of finding a better life, but it often turns out to be a frustrating journey. Many rural urban trekkers are employed in odd jobs that do not earn them a decent living. Urban planners argue governments need to restructure development by building employment centers that can take in all social classes. Authorities say it's a huge task controlling the growing number of informal workers on the streets.
We can have stalls set up for them. It can be from, let's say, 9 to 2 p.m. every Saturday, a designated place. They would make more decent sales than being daily on the streets. And then it would make sense that government is investing in walkways and pedestrians are utilizing them. Government is investing in markets and people, vendors, are utilizing them. Otherwise, it's not making sense.
The rapid population growth in Kampala has forced authorities to open up new cities with the hope of redistributing social services regionally. But developing new cities may take a long time. Uganda now has 10 cities from just 1 2 years ago.
If we are approving development plans, we need to see the distribution of services. How apart are homes from markets, are homes from shopping areas? Why do we allow one business to be redistributed within the same city more than 10 times, yet in the neighboring region, there is none?
Latest statistics from the World Bank show about 25% of Uganda's population lives in urban areas, and it's expected that by 2050, half of Uganda's population will be living in urban cities. Isabel Nakiria, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
Meanwhile, Nigeria's housing deficit is estimated at roughly 17 million, and the cost of rent in big cities like the country's commercial capital Lagos is sky high. But the paradox of Nigeria's housing challenge is that despite its huge housing deficit, many houses, especially in its two big cities of Abuja and Lagos, are empty because many can't afford them. CGTN's Digi Bademosi reports.
This is about the fifth property Simisola would be inspecting in about 1 month. She's been frantically searching for accommodation, but has not been able to find one. And it's not because houses are not available.
I'm even tired right now, as I really haven't found what I want. The places I've been to, the prices are beyond my budget. They are way beyond my budget. I'm working within what I can afford, and I've not seen something that, that suits me. I'm still on the search. Hopefully I find one.
It's a daily experience for prospective tenants like Simisola in Lagos. The cost of rent in the city is sky high, especially in highbrow areas. And even in areas that are not classified as highbrow, rents are going up rapidly as a result of the massive influx of people into the city on a daily basis.
And then aside the major rents, that's the rent fee, you see landlords ask for things like legal fees, there's the agent fee, there's the agreement fee. All these fees put together make the cost very, very difficult to meet.
The Lagos state government estimates the city's housing deficit at 2.5 million. But the city is also Nigeria's real estate capital. New developments are springing up everywhere in spite of the economic crunch in the country. Most of the new houses, though, are bigger homes like flats and duplexes and built for outright sale rather than rent. Very few developers engage in low-income buildings.
This is the only society where we buy land as though we are buying groceries from the supermarkets. You buy land, you're paying immediately. We're not talking of loan now, because even when you take loan, the interest is outrageous, 29% interest, and usually for a short term. So you need to immediately recoup your investment on that land. So when you build, you're not building a house for a long term. You're not also going to build a house that you can't sell.
The government is trying to bridge the gap. It's building low-cost housing estates and giving them out on rent-to-own basis, as well as providing mortgage facilities at single-digit interest rates to enable people own their own homes.
We have been able to deliver 13 major housing schemes all over the state within the last 2 years. We are still counting, because as I speak to you, work is ongoing on a number of housing construction sites all over the state.
The rent-to-own initiative is certainly beyond the reach of people like Simisola, who are just looking to rent alone. The Lagos state government says it will begin to implement a monthly tenancy policy in the city from next year, as against the yearly and in some cases 2-year rent advance payment. Should that policy work, it will certainly ease the pressure on people like Simisola, who make up a sizable number of the population of the city. DG Bademosi, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
And coming up in sports, Africa Handball Championship set for Morocco postponed.